Helen is, don't you?
Oh, we're live.
Right. Give it a few seconds just to get going. And it looks like we are on to the next webinar, the last Thursday in the month, which I really look forward to because it means that I get to talk to somebody who I like, who I rate, somebody really interesting. And I'm thrilled to introduce you to Helen Burt. Now, I met Helen about 18 months ago, and it was memorable for me. So, just to give you officially her title, she is the Chief Customer Office of, I think it's about the biggest division in National Grid based in Boston, although it's all different places in America. However, I met her in a very interesting way. I was out in Boston and I was meeting quite a few of the senior people in National Grid and meeting some of the trainers who'd been delivered to run the program and various people. And I was also doing quite a lot of live speaking engagements and virtual ones. And it was arranged that I was managing to sneak into Helen's diary for 30 minutes. So I got to her office before she did. And I was sitting in the office waiting for her to come in. And what I didn't know was that Helen had actually been listening to me on a virtual talk just before she came in. And she came into the office and I said, "Hi," stood up, Penny Ferguson. She said, "I want to be you." I thought, well, that's a bit different. And meeting Helen was really interesting. I'm sure you all know that occasionally you can meet somebody in your life and you meet them and you know that for whatever reason they're meant to come into your life. And I was with Helen for half an hour and I walked out of there having never met her before. And 30 minutes later, I knew I'd met a very close friend. And it was just amazing. So I'm so thrilled that Helen has been prepared to get up incredibly early because she is in Boston and has agreed to have a conversation with me. And I feel really honored that she's come and joined me on this conversation. So, Helen, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me first of all ask you to introduce yourself to all the lovely people who have joined us. There's been a lot of interest in you coming on. So, if you'd like to tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, maybe some of your journey and how you got here. So, a really lovely introduction would be amazing.
Oh, thank you, Penny, and thank you for that introduction. That absolutely true story, and it was just a lightning strike, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I'm currently the chief customer officer for National Grid. National Grid, of course, in the UK is it runs and operates the grid, but we actually have a number of companies. And among the companies that we have, we operate one of the largest utilities across the U.S. So we operate in the state of New York and we operate in the state of Massachusetts. And about 2 years ago, I was given the opportunity to come be the chief customer officer across this beautiful part of the world and this great company. And so I was very thrilled to be able to do that. My career goes back 35 years. I have been in the utility space across the U.S. in different companies, both from a consulting perspective as well as from an actual. I've been an executive in 3 different utilities across the U.S. One in Texas, one in California, and then one in now in the Northeast. Um, but my passion is about customers, and it's really where I've spent the bulk of my career, and really making those connections. From my perspective, it's a lot about a lot similar to making the connections with any human. So when you're building teams, there's a lot of similarities between how do you bring that humanity to the table? How do you bring humanity to the connection between my customer and I, or my teammate and I, um, or my peer and I? I mean, how do we bring that together? So my journey's been, like I said, 35 years. I started I actually grew up in a really rural part of Texas, and a very, very, very small rural um, school, unlike anything you guys in the UK can even imagine. It was just so tiny. Um, and went to university, and then after university, I went to work for. I did a couple of projects, and I went to work in the utility sector. And I really didn't think that's where I would land, and that would feed my passion. But it's technical enough for. I'm a bit of a nerd, so it's technical enough to keep me interested. And I really found out that for me, working in an industry that does something that matters fed me.
Okay.
So, I wanted to know that it made a difference. The work that I was doing, the work that my company did, that it served people. And so, the utilities, I'm an accidental utility nerd, a lifelong utility nerd. I just love utilities. I love working with the people. And so I worked for a number of years in Texas, and I left Texas as an executive in our deregulated markets and in our regulated markets. And I went to work in California, and I worked there for about 12 years. And I was on the executive team. I was the chief customer officer at PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric Company, for a number of years. And we did some amazing things, and really had a great stint there. And then I came to National Grid. So it's been quite a journey. I would say it's quite a leadership journey too. I think you find that people are more similar than they are different, and even the differences tend to be, in my opinion, more superficial, and the similarities between humans tend to be more genuine.
I think that's a really interesting comment. Explain that a bit more. I've never heard you say that before. I find that really interesting.
Yeah. So if you live in the US, you know that the difference between rural West Texas and San Francisco, California, culturally is night and day. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely night and day. The two groups couldn't be any different. They couldn't be, politics are different, sensibilities are different. And yet I found um, that at the core, the people weren't that different. I don't think I expected to find that when I went to, I led a team of about 5,000 in, in San Francisco. And I don't think I expected to find that humans are humans. And yet, when you think about it, of course, that's true, right? It doesn't, all the other stuff is a bit superficial. But when you get to that heart space, that's kind of what really matters.
I find that a really interesting thought. And my goodness, I mean, you couldn't have anything so different as they are. Everything about them is different
Yeah.
on the
Yeah.
surface.
On the
Everything.
surface. Right. Right.
Be interesting to know how much of your learning from that you were able to say, do I need to do things differently or change things different, the way I behave? And yet, from the sound of it, probably not.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think the growth and journey as a leader, and for me, it's always a journey. It's always growth, because I am not the leader I want to be every day, and I'm very candid with myself, very candid with my team. The leader I want to be is, that's what I strive to be, that living leader. I want to be that leader every day. I'm not. I don't make it every day. I think when I was younger, and the industry I've grown up in is very, there aren't that many women, and there certainly weren't that many women in leadership when I was growing up. And so you start to model leadership about, well, how am I supposed to be? Am I supposed to be um, just like a man? Am I supposed to dress like a man and behave like a man because the men are in leadership? And I have to say to you, that was my early learnings. That was I have to put an edge on. I have to put that. I can't be the human or the female that I am, and I can't lead in the way, because this is the way leaders behave. And I had some success. I'm not going to lie. I had some success. I can't say it was fulfilling.
Mm.
And I can't say that it was more than surface success. And I think the mark of a leader is not what happens when you're in leadership, but what happens when you leave leadership. Like, what do you leave behind? Are the people that you've worked with, and the changes that you've tried to make, are they enduring? Because if they're not enduring, you're just taking a bear. So I'm really passionate about what is the enduring change that you make, and how do you create that? And you can't do that. You and I've talked about this before. I think the most important thing that I learned about leadership is you got to be yourself, and anybody can smell a fake. And so, as hard as it was for me that first time, because again, my model had always been tough edge. And again, I'm talking Texas. And if you know the culture in Texas, it's very tough.
Yeah.
It's very tough and edgy. Um, but that's not who I am, right? And so, how do you bring both of those together to be your authentic self? And I think being authentic is probably the most important thing that any of us can do. Um, Certainly from a leadership perspective, even in your family, like even as a mom, I've got to be authentic.
So it's really interesting that you've just shared with everybody what I think is the most important characteristic of leadership. And it's interesting when I first started doing what I do, which, as you know, is about 30 years ago. And one of our very early clients who decided to do a rollout of our program was a police force. And in those days, you sure as hell didn't have any female chief constables. And the interesting thing was that the women had bigger balls than the men. They felt exactly like you did, as you're saying, in Texas. They had to be more macho, tougher, more ruthless, and it has changed, thank goodness, but it was really interesting to see it. But the other thing that I think is, and I think many people don't actually recognize this, it's very easy to say, be authentic. It's not always easy. It can take real courage because being authentic quite often means being vulnerable.
Yeah.
And I may have shared this with you, but I'll share it in case anybody here finds it interesting. Very early on, when I started rolling out the program, I occasionally got asked to go and do speaking engagements, and I got asked to go and do this speaking engagement to a group of, I don't know, it was 80 to 100 people. It was primarily men, probably about 85% men, and fairly techie, very much the IT industry. And they'd asked me to talk about responsibility. Now, as you know, because you've experienced our program, that when we talk about responsibility, I very much share my story, how I learned it, how I screwed up again and again and again before I really begun to understand the meaning of responsibility. And you could see in the audience, there were some people sort of like this, really, oh, wow. And others going, oh, God, too much information, don't need all this. and, and the feedback I got at the end of it ranged from really fascinating, took so much from that to really didn't need all that personal shit. So it ranged from up here to down there. And I had to think about it very hard because it probably isn't your bog standard consultant behavior to share personal things about you and who you are. And I reckon, Helen, I thought about it for about a month, thinking, okay, am I prepared to go out and be vulnerable, knowing I may really piss off some people?
Yeah.
Or, and that means being authentic, or do I behave more like your rather more typical consultant who shares all the good things but not who they are inside? And it was quite a tough decision, but at the end of the month I thought, no, I'm definitely going to choose to be authentic, and I've stood by that. I've never regretted it. There have been some clients I know are not the right people to work with me
Yeah.
because I say what I think. I mean, I say what I think. Doesn't mean to say I'm always right, because I'm often not, but I will always say, but I will tell you as I see it. But it takes courage, doesn't it?
It does. And I just want to pull on that thread a little bit about opening up and being vulnerable. And I'll share a story with you when I first joined National Grid. Um, I was asked, it was an all hands call for, I think it was all of the US. And I was asked to not share the typical, I mean, I just shared my little bio earlier in this meeting. I didn't tell you anything about who Helen is or who I am, right? But I was asked specifically, like, they know your bio, they know where you worked before, blah, 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 they know you know how to do this and they know you know how to do that. Will you please share something that completely changed the trajectory of your life? And so I thought about that, and I wasn't the only one who was introducing myself. We were both asked to do the same thing, and I'm not going to go into details about the other person, but they shared very, what I would consider very superficial, sort of things. How many kids you got? Where you grew up. Um, I shared the fact that I was a teenage mother and that, I was very smart and very nerdy in my young teenage years. And I got pregnant and had a child as a teenager. And he's lovely and he's just the delight of my life. But I planned to, I was on this big scholarship, blah, 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 my whole life planned out. And it completely changed the trajectory of my life for the best, absolutely for the best. And so I shared that story, and then the other person shared, well, I grew up in got two sisters. It's like, okay, whoa, I went way too personal on that. It was like I went probably deep in the vault. I also shared that I became a grandmother in my 30s. When you become a
Oh,
mother as a teenager, and your daughter also becomes a mother as a teenager, you can become a grandmother in your 30s. And that's what happened to me. So, and it was just wonderful, delightful, absolutely best moments of my life. Like I wouldn't be the person that I am, but so I shared all this stuff and I was like, oh dear, I was feeling really exposed. I'm like really exposed. Because I was like, oh, you idiot, here you are going to work for this, really big, big, big FTSE 100 company. And these people they're very proper. They're Brits. They're very proper. And you just told them your deepest, darkest, and, only the people who love you know it. And I was just like, I was just kicking myself. I'm serious. I was kicking myself. And then within probably, I don't know, 20 minutes, I started getting emails from women. And they were like, I was a mom as a teenager too. Thank you for sharing that story. How did it change you? How did it change you as because I guess the other thing about leadership is no matter what job you're in, I think this is for people who are good leaders. Like, you don't ever think of yourself as being different than the person that you were 20 years ago or 25 years ago. You don't identify yourself with, I am this position. You identify yourself in a human way. And so you don't recognize that the title that you carry sometimes has a really big weight. And so I'm glad I did it now because I heard and I was telling my daughter about it. I heard from so many women throughout the company who'd heard me speak about that, who
great.
were also teenage moms or their daughters were teenage moms, and that um, just that conversation about something that was so real and personal. But I have to tell you, I felt, oh my God, I'm just like, this is going to be the shortest career on record. Well, I'm getting the pink slip any day now.
And it's so right. People don't recognize how hard it can be and how courageous you need to be authentic. It's not always easy.
No,
It's easy, but it isn't always. I
no.
just there's a couple things I want to ask you. I'm really keen to ask you how you build a team. But before that, I want to ask you, because in your career, you'll have had many different bosses, many different people who some of them call themselves leaders and maybe something a bit different. However, out of all the people you've worked for in your career, who is the best leader you've worked for, and why is that individual the best?
Well, so I have more than one best. I mean, because I'm going to break this rule as well. There's not ever a single individual, but I've worked for many leaders that I've admired, and so I'll tell you the things that make them important to me and make them stand out. Um, and in my opinion, you learn more from bad experiences than you do from good experiences frequently. So I had some really, really terrible bosses that I was like, ooh, never do that. Never, ever do that. But on the positive side, I think you can pick up when someone's being honest with you and someone genuinely has your best interest at heart when it's not about building themselves up. And so I've had a few bosses that were that way, and some of them were the ones who pushed me to some of the things that scared me the most.
Okay.
Um, and they pushed me in a not in a show off way, but in a you're not going to fall very far. If you fall, I've got your back, but you can do this. And so, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But there are different bosses have different characteristics. The one that's probably most recent that I really enjoyed working for was one of your students, and I loved the fact that he had this way of asking these open ended questions that just were beautiful. And it was so natural, and I was like, oh, I have to learn how to do that. I have to learn how to do that because I'm not good at that. And it's just it's that's Badr Khan. I mean, he was fantastic about just turning something around in a questioning way. And of course, I've learned that technique with you, but turning something around in a questioning way that's so empowering
Yeah.
and so opening. And I never learned that technique before, and that was really really meaningful to me. But one of my early mentors that I worked with was also a woman who did a lot of servant leadership. So I studied servant leadership for a long time. But she gave me something to set on my desk, and I had it on my desk for I don't know 20 years. I can't find it now. I lost it in one of the moves, but it was just a little simple card, probably I don't know 5x7 sort of stiff card. I don't know, and it had printed on it, if you're not scaring yourself, you're not living up to your full potential. And I was like, that just gobsmacked me because I was like, okay, so being scared means that I'm living up to my potential. And if I find things scary, and I do every day, I'm not, I'm human like anybody else. Um, that's okay, that's okay. And so that profoundly changed sort of my career trajectory because I stopped running away from fear.
Wow. That is hugely powerful. If you stop running away from fear,
Yeah.
wow. I think a lot of people run away from it. I know there are times in my life, time and again, when I've run away from it, but maybe not run away, maybe procrastinated would be a better way of sort of holding back rather than going straight for it. So that
Well,
takes courage to do that.
yeah, and I mean it's not always, but I would just say that little voice in your head that says you can't do that.
Yeah,
It's a way of silencing that little voice,
yeah,
for me. And I think I was always raised to believe that you have gifts, and a person who has gifts is expected to give back. And
yeah,
so if I have a gift, then I'm expected to use that gift in a way that's of service. And don't be scared. Don't be scared. Um, I think for women, and I see this a lot because I'm in mentorship with several women and have throughout the years. You see that a lot from women in particular, where they're tenuous and they're fearful, and um, they don't have they lack the confidence. Just candidly, they lack confidence. And how do you give someone confidence? And I think that for me, that one placard on my desk all those years just said it all for me.
yeah. Quite often, I think you can get confidence if you've got somebody like Badar who asks really
Hmm.
good questions,
Hmm.
because the way he asks questions gave you already the feeling in your head that you could do it. You just needed to find the way to do it the best. As you
That
know, I
right.
rate. Badar incredibly highly. He's one of the best leaders I know. So
Agree.
having him as a boss, I wouldn't have met you without Badar, of
No,
course.
probably not.
Big
Probably
thank you to Badar. Big thank you. Now, Helen, let me come back to what I did want to ask you. I just want to share with you, as you know, I have run our program. I don't run the program now. I don't deliver the program. No, I've decided I'm old enough and ugly enough now, and I've done my stint. So,
not.
so, so but for the last years, the majority of programs that I ran was for very senior people, and it used to really fascinate me. And I'm probably not going to describe this in the best way possible, but I would so often find that this top team would come in, and very quickly in working with them, I think, gosh, these are a group of incredibly bright individuals, but they're nowhere close to being a team. And this was, and sometimes it could have been a team that had worked together for, it could be a year, 18 months, whatever, before they decided they wanted to do the program with us. There may be a couple of new people in it, but seeing them as a group of really bright individuals and thinking, how come they're not a team? Now, I'd really like to know, because I think this is important to a lot of people to hear this, because I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that nearly every group I first go to work with, I very rarely see a team, very rarely.
Of course.
How do you, because I know that you've done a lot of work in attempting to do this, and as you say, you never stop learning, but tell me how you think is the most effective way to begin to build a proper team.
Well, I mean, to me, that's the most important thing you could do. And I've built some really great teams in my career. Um, and in my experience, it comes down to the same thing. You have to have something that brings you together in a way as though you've been together doing hard things together for many, many years, right? So, what can you do that sort of creates that environment where walls break down, facades break down, people come together as who they are with their strengths and with their weaknesses. And that's why that honestly that's what I loved about your program. That first day on your program, oh my God, that was like pivotal. And I actually think I mean, I've done other programs, a lot of other programs across the years. I've only been doing Living Leader for, I don't know, 18 months since I met you. That's the hardest thing is like, what is it that breaks everything down so that you're standing there with people and you're giving others the full who you are and your full trust. And you're saying, I'm vulnerable in front of you. This is me with all my warts and everything that I do wrong or right. And I'm trusting you to cherish me and to come together with me. And I think the first day, that first introductory day of the 3-day program is just the secret. There's no question about it. When I took it with my team, the person who taught us went very, as we start to again unfurl our vulnerable selves, our real humanity. And the person that was teaching us went very deep in their own personal lives, and it just uncorked the bottle and made it safe for everyone else to talk. And for me, I told my team things that I hadn't told anyone ever. In fact, I had to like pull them aside and say, "You ever meet anybody who knows me from my private life? Whoop, do not." Which was unnecessary. They would never do that. But I found myself opening up in a way that I had never done before, and so did everybody in my team. And there's no time limit on that section. I find that fascinating. If it goes for an hour, if it goes for 2 hours, if it goes for 4 hours. And I found there were tears, there were, hugs, there was just genuine connection in the room. And I was like, oh, this is really powerful, because that's really the secret behind building a team, is that you give yourself and you trust others. And so then they give themselves and they trust you. And so that sort of two-way building of trust is the most important thing. I mean, everything's important in the sessions, and all of this stuff is important to learn and refresh and remind and practice. But that's really the most important part. And from my perspective, that's the most important part. You can't build real trust without vulnerability. And vulnerability it's scary. It's kind of back to the thing, you know, that we talked about. It's scary.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, it is fast. It never ceases to amaze me what comes out. I mean, we've got some CEOs, um, Chris Weston, for example. I think he's been through the program 5 or 6 times because every time he's gone into a new company, he's taken us with it, and he's done it. And I remember, I don't think it was the last one. I think it was the second to last one when he was over in Canada, and I with Direct Energy, and he asked me to go and do his top team program. Absolutely never to be forgotten. We started at 8:30, and Chris knows that always the trainer goes first, as you said, to set the
Right.
scene of being prepared to be open and vulnerable. And then it's who would like to go next. And Chris always knew he needed to very quickly say, "Why don't I?" Because as the CEO, if he hadn't opened up to demonstrate that he's prepared to be open and vulnerable, the others might be thinking, "Oh, I don't know how much I could say," or a little bit like that, and you would have done the same.
Exactly.
So Chris went first, and he doesn't mind me saying this. I have his permission, or I wouldn't. He was over in Canada, but his three boys. He'd got one of his children with him, but his three boys were over in the UK at school, and he was really missing them. And he was talking about how he'd been over there for meetings with the head office was in the UK. He'd been over for meetings there and managed to find time to pop in and watch one of his son's football
Oh,
games. And his son, halfway through, suddenly realized he was there and just, his face lit up like a moonbeam. The minute he got, there was it finished, he was over. Dad, you're here. So excited. And Chris was telling and saying how much, and there were tears just rolling down his face. And it was, really quite emotional. And I think about the third person to go was the HR director, and she was talking about, and she started in tears. And then there were another couple, and this other guy was talking about how he'd been finding the last few months tough because one of his friends had done. He was in tears. And there was one guy who'd joined who was very new. Can't remember what his position was. Could have been marketing director. And you could see him sitting there thinking, "God, what sort of company have I joined?" And then he went last. And what he shared about himself, I am not kidding. Everybody had their mouths open. He was in a similar position to what you're talking about. He'd been a teenage father,
mhm,
underage teenage
mhm.
father, so had to get permission from the courts and everything. And you could see, and it was, you cannot, we didn't finish till 4 o'clock. I was thinking, how am I going to get through the program? So
Doesn't
this
matter.
amazing. And Chris said to me, he said, "Pen, I don't care what you have to cut out. What you have just achieved is amazing." And as you know, we say to every trainer, don't join the group for dinner, let the group be on their own. And Chris said to me, "I don't care what you think, Penny, you're joining us for dinner tonight." The formation of an amazing team, but it is so important. But every company that we go into, they don't do that. And yet, when we do this with a team that, even if they've worked together for a long time, they come out of it at the end of that session and say, "I never knew that about you. I never knew that." And if you don't know the individual, how can you get your head around where they're being really difficult about something? A decision has to be made. And
Right.
it's because of something that's going on in their life that you knew nothing about. And it's so important. And yet hardly anybody does it. And I just can't understand why not.
Yeah, it is. It is one of those things. It's almost as though, and I think I've been guilty of this in my life. There's the work Helen and then the Helen. And what you find from a leadership perspective, the more you blur those two and there's just one, the better it is. I do know that some people have had trauma in their lives, and they just can't get fully there, but they can get closer. And
Yeah.
you kind of got to respect for whatever area, however far someone can go.
Yeah.
Because some people have had like mine was not traumatic, but some people have had really horrible trauma in their lives, and so you have to understand that. But just the openness and the non-judgmental, about how comfortable someone is or how comfortable they're not is also important, right? But I just think the blending of being one person, it's just one of those things um, that I've found to be incredibly important for me,
Yeah.
and I found it makes me more whole, overall. Sort of my mental health, my physical health, the way I think about things and the way I process things, just overall much more whole, much more healthy, much more able to put things into perspective
Yeah.
from a team from a team dynamic perspective. When you know sort of the more of the whole of a human that you're working with, then you can sort of understand, well, from their perspective, okay, I have to understand this is something that happened to them, or this is something that they've gone through. And so maybe they have a different perspective on what we're talking about. And so it's like it's like grace is granted because you understand more rather than it being more challenging, right? And then when you do need to challenge one another, it's safe because it has nothing to do with, me and you, Penny. It has to do with that thing we're talking about. And
It, yeah.
it's so much easier, so much easier.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And one of the things I'd also like to ask you is, you did this with your top team and you thought,
Yeah.
wow, this would be nice to bring this culture in. What is your experience of bringing leadership into any organization, and how important do you think it is to bring leadership into any company? Also, how far do you think it's important to take it down?
Yeah. So that's great. Those are great questions. So let me talk to you a little bit about my past and how I've done this in the past. And then I'll talk about what we're doing currently because I think it's better and it's a bit different. I've always thought it was critically important to bring leadership learning into the organization. I've always done it. For one selfish reason, I'm a student and I'm not an A+ student by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think it's almost like a constant thing for me in my honing my own skills and my practicing my own skills. But the second thing is that I think it's obviously teaching is a part of all learning and leading, but it's also one of those things where as a leader, showing vulnerability is not just about personal vulnerability. It's about, for example, there are things I'm extremely good at, and there's things I really am not good at. They're not the things I enjoy doing, and so I tend to put them off, and I tend to procrastinate. And I've always found that bringing leadership and bringing an understanding of who everyone is gives voice to everyone at the table. So if I'm really, if I get bored with routine, for example, which I do, then someone who loves, like the lawyers in the world who love the rigor and the of routine and like just the precedence, and that's a voice that needs to be heard, and because I might wear more stripes and that person may not feel brave, their voice may not be heard. So I've always thought those kinds of things are also about leadership and about the discussion on how you lead and how you bring everyone's voice to the table. Because I've already told you, like, I'm pretty fearless and I got a big mouth and I talk about all the time, and so I can be, and I wear some stripes, so I can be pretty intimidating, and I'm clearly aware of my shortcomings, and I want my team to be aware of them as well so that their voice is heard. So I've always done that, and it's always been very kind of structural for me. It's like a part of what I have always done. Oddly enough, in now I want to talk about what we're doing. So I've done different programs, lots of different programs, and lots of different specially tailored programs and stuff like that. But oddly enough, in this living leader thing is this program has kind of gone viral, so it's gotten completely out of my control. Um, I've never had a leadership program go viral. I've never, ever, ever had one go viral. So it's, I have to say, it's really, it was really surprising. I mean, just, suddenly it's like, I don't even know who's taking it anymore or where it's being taught or anything. And um, I think that's the mark of a program that's making a difference. So I think it will make, I talked about as a leader, it doesn't matter what you do while you're there. It matters what you do, what happens when you leave. And this is something that I know is going to be at least something that you should be proud of as a legacy, because I have never in my 35 years had a leadership program that went viral where people are asking to get into it and like, then writing these random notes about, oh my God, this is awesome. It's changed my life. It's made me think about things differently. And that's really this, I think the secret about what you've put together is that, I don't know why other ones didn't go viral, but they didn't. And I've done this a lot. So congrats to you on that, because um, I think leadership can't be foisted on people, and people, some people are in a place in their life where they just, they just can't, and fine. But I think when you've got a program like we're doing now, where people are just clamoring to get into these programs and get into the programs and be a part of the programs, I think it is. I think it's just incredibly powerful. And if I had my brothers, everybody'd have the opportunity to go through it. I don't know that we'll get there, but I definitely think it's part. And I don't think just because you don't lead people doesn't mean that you're not a leader.
Exactly.
Um, Leadership is not about position. Leadership is about who you are and how you show up, and it's not. And so, from my perspective, it's not just a hierarchical thing.
I think that is incredibly important. I mean, for me, as I've said very openly, when I first designed our program, I realized the very first thing I realized was I hadn't understood leadership. And it was the first year of delivering the program that helped me understand leadership at a much deeper level, if you like, at a heart level rather
Yeah,
than just head level.
yeah,
And for me now, leadership is the foundation of my life, everything. You know, the fact I've stopped delivering the program doesn't mean to say I'm still not a leader. It's every part of your life, every way you choose to live your life. And I think that's key. I mean, it's incredibly exciting for us, I have to say, working with you, that it's going viral. I mean, it's really fabulous seeing people buying into it, wanting to continue walking the talk, living it. Some of your trainers are really exceptional, really
yeah. I think,
exceptional.
and they're enjoying it too. I mean, it brings them joy. And I wanted to pick up on something you said, though, Penny. You talked about heart and head, and I think if you could, so I'm going to say this to you and get your reaction on it.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I think that's been the biggest growth for me in leadership. Is I used to be a head leader, and I didn't understand how much more important it was to be a heart leader. And that if you probably just gave me the words to sort of describe my own personal evolution, it is about heart leadership and not about head leadership.
I think you're right, but I think it's having the combination of the two
Mhm.
so that you get the balance right. And I think an awful lot of people, and I think actually it starts as young as school, there's so much education around head and almost none around how do you bring your heart into it. And so, and I think it starts very young. There's a lot of academia. When you go to university, there's a lot of academia. That's all about head more than anything. And I think that maybe you've got to recognize I've never experienced my program. I've never been on
Yeah,
it.
but that's right. It's
No,
great.
I've never been on it. But that's how a lot of people will describe it. It's not so much about leaving a program where you hear about, yeah, if I do this, 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 and this, I could be more successful, more effective, on all of that. You may have got some of that, but it almost goes from head to heart. It's not so much I want to do different, it's I want to be different.
Mhm.
Suddenly it begins to come from a different place. And it's one of the things. that we say to anybody who becomes a trainer of the program. And this is a really quite difficult thing to explain. But people who've become trainers, when you first qualify to be able to deliver the program, you're very much concentrating from head. I need to remember to do this, that link. So it's very much about head. After you've run quite a few, the only way to describe it is it's as though the program doesn't come from you, it comes through you.
Yeah.
So it almost becomes part of who you are. And that's what really takes you to an extraordinary level. And I think a lot of people will say, people who've been through the masterclass will say that they live their lives in a different way. And I know you're committed to going through that. And I know the minute you find the time in your diary, you're going to do it. And maybe I'll then have you back on here saying, right, now what level have you
What have
gone?
you learned? What have you learned? I'm sure I've learned a lot. I am going to go back through the 3-day class. I've got a new team. We're building out our team. So we definitely need to do that.
Okay.
And do it together. But
Yeah.
I think I do think it's that hard head connection, and even when, I talked about um, my space, which is about engaging with customers, you have to engage them at the heart level. You can't just engage them at the head level. You
Yeah.
just don't get there. It's important to engage intellectually,
Yeah.
but if it's only an intellectual engagement, it's a pretty superficial thing.
I think, and I absolutely agree with you. Now, one of the things I really want to ask you is this. I know what your title is, but you're almost like a mini CEO of your division. Okay. You're the top of your division. That can be a bloody lonely place to be. How do you cope with that?
Um, that's a very good question, because it is, as a human, I get just as frustrated as anybody else does, and I get just as worried as anybody else does, and I get just as, oh dear, what am I going to do about that? And I think from I'm pretty open. I have peer relationships that I rely on too, and I ask for permission to vent. I need to vent. I need to vent about something. Like, I'm really concerned about this, and sometimes just the process will sort of help me work through kind of what's going on. I am I'm the head of customer across the U.S., but I do have a lot of support. I have to say, I have an incredible support network, and I look at people who are in a real CEO position that they're way more. It's way more difficult, because I just don't think that support network is necessarily there. And I do have one. It's one I rely on quite a bit too, and I don't hesitate to talk to someone if I need to talk to someone. I was like, I just need to think out. I need to think out loud. I need to talk about this out loud, and that's what you do, and it sort of makes things easier. What I've learned in this journey, again, it's about knowing your team and understanding the people that you work with come to the world with a different perspective because they've had a different experience. And the fact that they've had a different experience means they might look at the world differently. And I've always just been really willing to ask for a safe space to talk about something in the right way with the right people. Obviously, I don't gossip or anything like that, but if I'm really concerned about something, I'll definitely turn to a peer and or to a superior and just say, you know, set this one aside. I just need to talk about this. I don't need you to make this decision for me. And I'm not asking you to make this decision, but I do need to have a sounding board. And I've yet to find anybody that I've worked for or worked with who wouldn't say, "Oh, absolutely. What can I do?" And I think that's how you sort of get through some of those things because some of them are annoying and some of them are frustrating and some of them are a little scary and some of them are all those things.
Yeah, and it's not always easy. And one of the things that I have often found interesting, because to know how you are doing as a leader, the people who are going to be able to give you the best feedback are the people you lead.
Yes.
And yet a lot of people are really nervous about telling their boss either, well, that funnily enough, they're just as bad about telling them what they really like that they're doing as they are nervous about telling them areas that they don't like what they're doing. They're really, really bad. And so I see some senior people who potentially are really good, but nobody's giving them feedback. So they blindly go along
Yeah.
thinking they're doing a good job, and underneath people saying, what the hell are they doing that for?
Stuffing it. Yep.
Make
Yep.
decisions.
Well,
And
I resemble that remark quite a bit because I've certainly been that person. It's funny. Most of the people on my team, there's one in particular I'll tell you about that is superb about giving me feedback, private feedback, and it happens to be one of the females, and
I know, I
she'll
know
text
who.
me, she'll text me and she'll say, "Living leader?" question mark. And I was like, no, I'm not being a living leader. Thank you for pointing that out. And now it's to the point it's just a LL question mark. It's like, no, thank you. Because, again, I started this conversation out by saying I'm not the leader I want to be every day. I'm very human. I'm, I'm human.
I know, and it's amazing that you are getting it, but I see so many people who don't, and it's so sad.
Yeah.
It's so sad because they assume they're doing an okay job. Nobody really tells them. I mean, I remember coming over and having a half a day, well, nearly a day with you, and doing an exercise with you all. God, I admired you all for doing it that day. And I think I asked all of you to share with each person in the team three things. One thing that you wanted that individual to start doing, one thing you wanted that individual to stop doing, and one thing you wanted that individual to do more of. So, Gutsy, you went first. So, each person in your team came up with those three things. And what you weren't allowed to was to be defensive. You were allowed to ask questions to find out why they thought that and everything, and then decide at the end whether you wanted time to think about it or whether you had agreement or whatever. But what you weren't allowed to do is get defensive. And my God, you all had guts, and my God, there was some emotion in that room. But it takes courage to do that. But that's what builds the real resilience and the real ongoing learning as to how to be a great leader. I mean, you were all very vulnerable on that day, and I took my hat off to all of you. It was amazing.
And I think it's almost an automatic forgiveness when we fail too, right?
Yeah.
It's like when someone steps on it, it's like there's not a hardness or a judgment. It's an automatic forgiveness without even being asked, oh, geez, Helen, I stepped in it. I shouldn't have done that. You don't even, because it just happens when you build those kind of working relationships. And we always have a long way to go, and we have to practice at it all the time. And some days are fabulous and some days aren't. Um, but I think everybody is a work in progress, and I think our team is a work in progress.
Yeah, I'm sure. And how great that you're thinking of doing it a second time with when you've now got your new team in place.
Yeah,
That
we've got a couple more additions that we're sourcing right now, and I just think I think it's important, even though they've been through it before. The ones that are here have been through it before. That we do it again, because then it's about solidifying as a team, and experience something together. So I don't
and
know if
you
it'll
will.
be the second time or not. I have no idea.
No, well, you'll let us know when you're ready. And the one thing I will suggest quite strongly is that you have a different person delivering it
Oh yeah, for sure.
than you had before.
Yeah,
I think you had Sherilyn, did you? I can't remember.
yeah.
So it'd be good for you to have somebody completely different, because there'll be a different style. And Chris always said, and Paul always said, although they did it 5 or 6 times, they took something new from it every time. So I think it's important. Now, we haven't got long left, and I just want to ask you one last thing. You've been through so many things, and as you say, your leadership journey is ongoing, and you want it to be ongoing always. Um, there's a lot of people from different levels who are listening to this. If you wanted to share with them one or two things that you think they could do, or that was important for them to really take on board to be a more effective or inspired leader, what might you share with them?
So there's probably two things. Well, maybe three. One of them, which I think is in my viewpoint the most important thing, is find that authenticity, because people can smell it when you're not being real, and you're not being human, and you're not being genuine. So to me, that's the most important thing. I would say secondarily, from a leadership perspective, is the thing I talked about scaring yourself a little bit. You should be scaring yourself a little bit. You shouldn't hold back because something feels scary, you know. And I think the third thing is, and it's probably the most important thing, is to learn to ask those questions. You know, those living leader questions where you're asking that open-ended question, if you knew you could. And it is the most empowering um, thing. And if you can get that where it rolls off the tongue naturally, so it is a part of an authentic discussion. Oh, it just opens everything up. By the way, I don't do that well. That is one of the things I'm working on mightily, but I don't do that well. So I'll have to say, in the fashion of living leader, I have to like prefix it because it doesn't roll off my tongue naturally yet. But the powerful effect of that open-ended question, and it's not just about it being an open-ended question. It's an open-ended question with a presumption of complete success.
Yes.
And so when you frame it that way, it's like, oh, well, yeah. And it is. I always talk about life hacks. That's a little leadership hack, I think.
Yeah, and I expect you've probably got the notes on your desk. I know you're at home now, but notes on your desk, little incisive questions in the pack, so that occasionally you pull one out.
I
Think,
do.
okay.
I don't do it. I'm admitting now I don't do it often enough. But it is one of those things that you can even ask yourself. You know, like when you're really stewing about something.
Yeah.
You sort of put yourself in that. If you ask yourself that question, if I knew I could be completely successful at this, what would I do? And it's astounding how it opens up everything.
Well, Helen, we've just about come to the end. Can you believe we've been talking for an hour?
It always seems like 5 minutes with you, Penny. I really enjoy it.
But I just want to say a huge thank you. I'm so grateful for you for this conversation. I'm not just grateful for that. I'm so grateful for you coming into my life. It's the richer for having you in it. And I love you dearly. I hope you'll be in my life
Way.
always.
I feel the same way. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Helen.